The summer heat in London was unbearable that Tuesday afternoon. Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old software engineer from Denver, wiped the sweat from his forehead as he walked through the crowded streets near Buckingham Palace. This was his first trip to England, and he had planned every detail of his vacation for months. The excitement of being in a foreign country filled him with energy, but the oppressive heat was starting to drain his enthusiasm. Marcus had always been the type of person who loved attention. Back home in Colorado, he was known among his friends as the guy who would do anything for a laugh. His social media accounts were filled with videos of him pulling pranks, doing silly dances in public places, and generally making a fool of himself for the entertainment of others. He had over 50,000 followers on his various platforms, and the constant need for new content drove him to seek out increasingly bold stunts. As he approached the gates of Buckingham Palace, Marcus noticed the crowd gathering around the famous red-uniformed guards. These soldiers, known as the Queen's Guard, stood motionless at their posts, their tall black hats creating an imposing silhouette against the palace walls. Tourists from around the world were taking pictures, trying to get the guards to react, but the soldiers remained perfectly still, their faces emotionless and their eyes staring straight ahead. Marcus pulled out his phone and began recording, watching as other tourists attempted various tactics to break the guards' concentration. Some made funny faces, others told jokes loudly, and a few even tried to touch the guards' uniforms. But nothing worked. The guards remained as still as statues, completely professional in their duty. The heat continued to beat down on everyone in the area. Marcus noticed that even the tourists were beginning to look uncomfortable, fanning themselves with brochures and seeking shade wherever they could find it. The guards, however, showed no signs of discomfort despite wearing their heavy wool uniforms and tall bearskin hats. Marcus wondered how they could stand there for hours in such conditions without showing any sign of distress. As he moved closer to get a better view, Marcus spotted a small fountain nearby where children were playing in the water. The sight of the cool water gave him an idea that would change everything. He looked at the guard standing closest to the fountain, a tall man with broad shoulders who appeared to be in his 30s. The guard's face was completely expressionless, his eyes focused on some distant point beyond the crowd. Marcus felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came before he attempted one of his pranks. He knew this would make incredible content for his social media channels. The thought of going viral with a video of him getting a reaction from one of the famous unmoving guards was too tempting to resist. He imagined the likes, comments, and shares that would flood his accounts if he could pull off something truly spectacular. Without thinking about the consequences, Marcus approached the fountain and cupped his hands, filling them with the cool water. The tourists around him were too busy taking their own photos to pay much attention to what he was doing. The guard remained motionless, unaware of what was about to happen. Marcus positioned himself at the perfect angle to capture everything on his phone camera. He set up the recording, making sure the guard was clearly visible in the frame. His heart was racing with excitement as he prepared to execute his plan. This was going to be the prank that would make him famous, he thought to himself. The moment felt suspended in time as Marcus stood there with the water in his hands, the phone recording, and the unsuspecting guard maintaining his professional stance just a few feet away. The crowd continued to buzz around them, completely unaware that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. Marcus took a deep breath, steadied his phone, and prepared to make his move. Little did he know that this single moment of poor judgment would lead to consequences he never could have imagined, and that the guard's response would teach him a lesson about respect, duty, and the true meaning of service that would stay with him for the rest of his life. With a swift motion, Marcus flung the water directly at the guard's face and uniform. The cold liquid splashed across the soldier's red tunic and dripped from his chin, but incredibly, the guard didn't flinch. Not even a muscle twitched. Marcus laughed loudly, holding up his phone to capture the moment, expecting to see some kind of reaction that would make his video go viral. The crowd around them gasped in shock. Several tourists stepped back, realizing that what they had just witnessed crossed a serious line. Children pointed at the wet guard while their parents quickly pulled them away, sensing that trouble was brewing. An elderly British woman shook her head in disgust and muttered something about disrespectful Americans under her breath. Marcus, however, was completely oblivious to the tension building around him. He was too focused on his phone screen, checking if he had captured the perfect shot. He even considered doing it again from a different angle to get better footage. The rush of pulling off such a bold prank in front of so many people filled him with pride. He could already imagine the comments praising his courage and creativity. What Marcus didn't realize was that Sergeant James Wellington, the guard he had just soaked, was a decorated military veteran with 15 years of service. James had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had been awarded several medals for his bravery and dedication. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace was considered one of the highest honors in the British military, and James took his duty extremely seriously. Behind his motionless exterior, James was processing what had just happened. Years of military training had taught him discipline and self-control that most people couldn't even imagine. While every instinct told him to react, his professional training kept him perfectly still. The water continued to drip from his uniform, but he remained focused on his duty. The other guards in the area had witnessed the incident, but continued to maintain their positions. This was not the first time a tourist had acted inappropriately, but the blatant disrespect of throwing water was something that rarely happened. The guards communicated through subtle signals that only they could understand, alerting each other to the situation without breaking their professional composure. Marcus finally looked up from his phone and noticed that the atmosphere around him had changed dramatically. The friendly chatter of tourists had been replaced by an uncomfortable silence. People were staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Some were taking pictures of him, but not in admiration. They were documenting what they clearly saw as shameful behavior. A security officer who had been monitoring the area began moving through the crowd toward Marcus. The officer had been watching the situation unfold and knew that immediate action was necessary. Protocol dictated that anyone who interfered with or assaulted a guard needed to be dealt with swiftly and appropriately. Marcus started to feel the first hints of nervousness as he realized that his prank might have bigger consequences than he had anticipated. He looked back at the guard who remained completely motionless despite being soaked. For the first time, Marcus began to question whether what he had done was actually funny or just cruel. The summer heat that had seemed so oppressive earlier now felt insignificant compared to the heat of embarrassment that was beginning to creep up Marcus's neck. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, and none of them seemed friendly. The excitement of pulling off his prank was quickly being replaced by a growing sense of dread. James, still maintaining his position despite the water dripping from his uniform, was silently counting down the minutes until his shift change. He knew that once he was relieved of his duty, he would be able to address the situation properly. The young American tourist had no idea what was coming, but James was already planning his response. The crowd continued to grow as word spread about what had happened. Some tourists were filming the aftermath, creating their own content about the disrespectful behavior they had witnessed. Marcus found himself becoming the center of attention in a way he had never intended, and the reality of his situation was starting to sink in. As the security officer got closer, Marcus began to understand that his simple prank had escalated into something much more serious than he had ever imagined. The security officer, a stern-faced man in his 40s named Officer Davies, reached Marcus and tapped him firmly on the shoulder. "Sir, I need you to come with me immediately," he said in a voice that left no room for argument. The officer's tone was professional, but carried an underlying authority that made Marcus's stomach drop. Marcus tried to play innocent, putting on his most charming smile. "Hey, it was just a harmless prank, man. No big deal, right?" The guard didn't even react, so no harm done. He gestured toward James, who continued to stand perfectly still with water still visible on his uniform. Marcus hoped his casual attitude would diffuse the situation and allow him to walk away with just a warning. Officer Davies was not amused. He had seen countless tourists over the years, and he could easily distinguish between innocent mistakes and deliberate disrespect. "Sir, you have just assaulted a member of Her Majesty's Guard. This is a serious offense that carries significant legal consequences. You need to understand the gravity of what you've done." The word assault hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He had never thought of his prank in those terms. In his mind, he had just thrown some water for a laugh. The idea that he could face real legal trouble for something he considered harmless was beginning to terrify him. "Assault? Come on, it was just water. I didn't hurt anyone." As Officer Davies began to escort Marcus away from the scene, more security personnel arrived to manage the growing crowd of onlookers. The incident had attracted significant attention, and people were still taking photos and videos of the aftermath. Some tourists were posting about it on social media in real time, describing the shocking behavior they had witnessed. Meanwhile, Sergeant James Wellington continued his duty for another 20 minutes until his scheduled replacement arrived. During this entire time, he never once broke his composure, despite the discomfort of his wet uniform clinging to his skin in the heat. When his replacement finally took position, James was able to step away from his post for the first time since the incident occurred. James walked calmly to the guardhouse, where several of his fellow soldiers were waiting. They had all heard about what happened and were eager to know how their colleague was handling the situation. James's reputation among his peers was that of a man who never lost his cool, even in the most challenging circumstances. "The American tourist is with security now," one of the guards informed James as he began to change out of his wet uniform. "Word is he's trying to claim it was just a harmless joke. Apparently, he's some sort of social media personality who does this kind of thing for attention." James nodded silently as he processed this information. Learning that the attack was premeditated for social media content made it even more insulting. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment or a child's innocent mistake. It was a calculated attempt to humiliate him for entertainment and online fame. Back in the security office, Marcus was becoming increasingly agitated as the seriousness of his situation became clear. Officer Davies had explained that throwing water on a guard could be classified as assault, and that charges could include disorderly conduct, harassment, and potentially more serious offenses depending on how the incident was classified. "Look, I'm really sorry, okay?" Marcus pleaded, his earlier confidence completely gone. "I didn't know it was such a big deal. Can't we just forget this happened? I'll delete the video and never do anything like this again." His voice was getting higher with panic as he realized his vacation was about to become a legal nightmare. Officer Davies maintained his professional demeanor. "The decision about charges will depend on several factors, including the guard's own statement about the incident. You'll need to wait here while we complete our investigation." He left Marcus alone in the small office to contemplate his actions. Marcus sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, staring at his phone and wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The video he had been so excited about now felt like evidence against him. He thought about his job back home, his family, and how they would react if they found out he had been arrested in London for assaulting a royal guard. Outside, James had finished changing and was preparing to give his official statement about the incident. His fellow guards were encouraging him to pursue the matter fully, pointing out that letting such behavior slide would only encourage other tourists to act disrespectfully. James knew they were right, but he was also considering something else entirely, something that would surprise everyone involved. James Wellington walked toward the security office with measured steps, his mind made up about how he wanted to handle this situation. His fellow guards had expected him to demand the harshest possible punishment for the disrespectful tourist, but James had something else in mind. Years of military service had taught him that sometimes the most powerful lessons came not from punishment, but from understanding. When James entered the security office, Marcus looked up with frightened eyes. The young American had been sitting alone for over an hour, and the reality of his situation had finally sunk in completely. His hands were shaking slightly, and his earlier bravado had been replaced by genuine fear and regret. "You're the guard Marcus started to say, then stopped, unsure of how to finish the sentence without making things worse. James stood at attention for a moment, then slowly removed his tall bearskin hat and set it on the desk between them. For the first time, Marcus could see the man behind the uniform clearly. James had kind but serious eyes, graying hair at his temples, and a face that showed the weathering of someone who had seen real hardship and responsibility. "My name is Sergeant James Wellington," he said in a calm, measured voice. "I've been serving in Her Majesty's forces for 15 years. I've served 3 tours in Afghanistan, lost friends in combat, and have dedicated my life to serving my country with honor and dignity." Marcus felt his throat tighten. This wasn't the angry confrontation he had expected. The quiet dignity in James's voice was somehow more powerful than any shouting would have been. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I thought it was just... James raised his hand gently to stop him. Before you say anything else, I want you to understand something. When you threw that water at me, you weren't just pranking a tourist attraction or a living statue. You were attacking a real person who was simply doing his job. A job that I take great pride in and that represents something much larger than myself. The security officers in the room watched in amazement as James continued. They had expected him to demand immediate prosecution, but instead he was choosing to educate rather than simply punish. Do you know what it means to stand guard at Buckingham Palace? James asked, his voice remaining steady and patient. It means being trusted with the safety and security of the royal family. It means representing the finest traditions of the British military. It means standing perfectly still for hours, regardless of weather, distractions, or personal discomfort, because duty comes before everything else. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. He was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had done and the person he had done it to. James continued, When you threw that water at me, you disrespected not just me personally, but every soldier who has ever worn this uniform. You made a mockery of the sacrifice and dedication that this position represents. And you did it for what? Internet fame? A few likes on social media? The words hit Marcus harder than any physical punishment could have. He realized that his thoughtless act had been an attack on something sacred to this man, and to countless others who served their country. Sergeant Wellington, I don't know what to say. I feel sick about what I did. I never thought about any of those things. James studied Marcus's face carefully, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus mere fear of consequences. What he saw was a young man who was truly beginning to understand the gravity of his actions. The question now, James said, is what you're going to do with this understanding. Officer Davies stepped forward, clearly confused by the direction the conversation was taking. Sergeant Wellington, are you planning to press charges? We have clear evidence of assault and the incident was witnessed by dozens of people. James was quiet for a long moment, considering his options. He could easily pursue criminal charges that would result in Marcus facing serious legal consequences, potentially including jail time and a permanent criminal record. The young American would certainly deserve whatever punishment the law allowed. But James was thinking about something his commanding officer had once told him during his deployment in Afghanistan. Sometimes the greatest victory comes not from defeating your enemy, but from turning him into an ally. Marcus waited in agonizing suspense, knowing that his entire future hung in the balance of whatever decision this remarkable man would make. The room was completely silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall and the distant sounds of London traffic outside. James looked directly into Marcus's eyes and made a decision that would shock everyone in the room and change both of their lives in ways neither could have imagined. I'm not going to press charges, James announced quietly, causing everyone in the room to stare at him in disbelief. Officer Davies opened his mouth to protest, but James continued before anyone could speak. However, I do have conditions that must be met if this young man wants to avoid criminal prosecution. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was immediately replaced by anxiety about what these conditions might be. He had learned enough about Sergeant Wellington in the past few minutes to know that whatever he was about to propose would not be easy. James leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. You're going to spend the next week learning what it really means to serve others. You're going to volunteer at the Royal Hospital Chelsea, working with retired military veterans who gave their health and sometimes their limbs for their country. You're going to hear their stories, help with their daily needs, and understand what real sacrifice looks like. The proposition caught Marcus completely off guard. He had expected community service or a fine, but this was something entirely different. A week working with veterans, he repeated, trying to process what was being asked of him. That's not all, James continued. You're also going to create new content for your social media platforms, but this time it will be about the veterans you meet and the stories they have to share. Instead of using your influence to mock and disrespect, you're going to use it to honor and educate. You're going to show your 50,000 followers what real heroes look like. Officer Davies looked skeptical about this unconventional approach. Sergeant Wellington, are you sure about this? The man committed assault. There should be legal consequences. James stood up and faced the security officer. Officer Davies, I've spent 15 years learning that sometimes the most effective justice isn't found in a courtroom. This young man made a mistake born of ignorance and selfishness. Punishing him with jail time will teach him to avoid getting caught, but it won't teach him to respect the service and sacrifice of others. Marcus was struggling to understand why. This man he had wronged was showing him such unexpected mercy. Sergeant Wellington, why are you doing this? I mean, why aren't you just throwing the book at me? I would deserve it. James sat back down and looked thoughtful for a moment. During my second tour in Afghanistan, our unit was ambushed, and I was wounded. A local Afghan man, someone we had been taught to view with suspicion, risked his own life to help get me to safety. When I asked him later why he helped an enemy soldier, he told me something I've never forgotten. The room was completely silent as James continued. He said, because anger and revenge only create more anger and revenge, but teaching and understanding can create something better. That man could have let me die, could have taken revenge for all the ways his country had been hurt by war. Instead, he chose to save a life and teach a lesson. Marcus felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as he understood the parallel James was drawing. So you're giving me a chance to learn instead of just being punished? I'm giving you a chance to understand what you attacked today, James replied. Service, sacrifice, honor, duty. These aren't just words or concepts for tourist entertainment. They're lived experiences that have shaped the lives of thousands of men and women who put others before themselves every single day. Officer. Davies was still uncomfortable with the arrangement, but he could see that Sergeant Wellington was determined to handle things this way. What happens if he doesn't follow through on these conditions? James's expression became stern. Then criminal charges will be filed immediately, and Mr. Thompson will face the full legal consequences of his actions. But something tells me that won't be necessary. He looked directly at Marcus. Will it? Marcus shook his head vigorously. No, sir, absolutely not. I'll do everything you've asked and more. I promise you that. He paused, then added quietly, Sergeant Wellington, I still don't understand why you're being so kind to me after what I did. James stood up and picked up his bearskin hat. Because 15 years of military service has taught me that the best way to defeat disrespect is with dignity, and the best way to overcome ignorance is with education. You're going to learn both of those lessons over the next week. As James prepared to leave, Marcus called out to him. Sergeant Wellington? Thank you. I know I don't deserve this chance, but I swear I'm going to make the most of it. James paused at the door and looked back. Don't thank me yet, Mr. Thompson. Thank me after you've spent a week learning what real service looks like. Then we'll see if you truly understand what you did today and why it matters. The next morning, Marcus stood nervously outside the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, a red brick building that had been home to retired British soldiers for over 300 years. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with thoughts about what he would encounter inside. This was so far removed from his normal life that he felt like he was entering a completely different world. Sarah Mitchell, the volunteer coordinator, met Marcus at the entrance. She was a woman in her 50s with a warm smile but sharp eyes that seemed to see right through him. Mr. Thompson, Sergeant Wellington has told me about your situation. I want to be clear from the start. These men have earned the right to be treated with dignity and respect. They don't need anyone's pity, but they do deserve your complete attention and genuine care. As Marcus walked through the corridors, he was struck by the atmosphere of quiet dignity that permeated the building. These weren't broken men waiting to die as he had somehow expected. Instead, he saw proud individuals who carried themselves with the same bearing that Sergeant Wellington had shown, despite their advanced age and various physical limitations. His first assignment was to help in the dining hall during breakfast. As he served tea and assisted residents who needed help cutting their food, Marcus began to hear fragments of their stories. There was Harold, an 85-year-old who had served in Korea and still insisted on polishing his own shoes every morning. There was William, who had lost his leg in Northern Ireland but spent his afternoons teaching chess to local children who visited the hospital. You're the lad who got himself in trouble with one of the guards, aren't you? Asked George, a veteran of the Falklands War who used a wheelchair but had arms that looked like they could still handle any physical challenge. Word travels fast around here. Marcus felt his face burn with embarrassment. Yes, sir. I made a terrible mistake, and Sergeant Wellington is giving me a chance to learn from it instead of going to jail. George studied him for a moment, then nodded approvingly. James Wellington is a good man. Served with his father in the 80s. Military families, they understand duty in a way most people never will. If he thinks you're worth saving, then maybe you are. Over the following days, Marcus threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised everyone, including himself. He helped residents with their daily routines, listened to their stories, and began to understand the depth of sacrifice that military service had required from each of them. These men had given up years of their lives, missed their children's birthdays, lost friends in combat, and carried physical and emotional scars that would last forever. On his third day, Marcus met Thomas, a 90-year-old D-Day veteran who had lost his sight during the war, but still maintained an incredible spirit and sense of humor. As Marcus helped Thomas with his correspondence, the old soldier began telling him about the friends he had lost during the invasion of Normandy. "We were just boys, really," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Most of us had never been away from home before, and suddenly we were storming beaches under machine gun fire. I lost my sight when shrapnel from a mortar round caught me in the face, but I was one of the lucky ones. I lived." Marcus found himself genuinely moved by these stories, and something fundamental began to shift in his perspective. These weren't just historical figures or symbols. They were real people who had faced unimaginable challenges with courage and selflessness. The idea that he had mocked such dedication and service made him feel physically sick. On his fourth day, Marcus began creating the social media content that Sergeant Wellington had requested. But instead of his usual over-the-top style, he found himself speaking quietly and respectfully about the men he was meeting. He shared Harold's story about writing letters to the families of fallen soldiers for 60 years after the war ended. He posted about William's determination to stay active and useful despite his disability. He talked about Thomas's incredible memory for the names and faces of friends who had died decades ago. The response from his followers was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Instead of the usual jokes and superficial comments, people were sharing their own family military stories and expressing genuine appreciation for the veterans. His follower count actually began to grow as word spread about his new content. But for the first time in his social media career, the numbers didn't matter to him. Sarah Mitchell noticed the change in Marcus immediately. "You know," she told him on his fifth day, "when Sergeant Wellington first described his plan for you, I thought it was too good to be true. I've seen plenty of young people come through here doing community service, and most of them just count the hours until they can leave. But you're different." Marcus was helping Thomas write a letter to a school class that had sent them thank you cards. "I think I'm starting to understand what Sergeant Wellington was trying to teach me," he replied. "These men represent something I've never really thought about before. The idea that some things are more important than yourself." As his week at the Royal Hospital Chelsea neared its end, Marcus realized that he had learned more about honor, duty, and genuine service in 5 days than he had in his entire previous life. The men he had met had shown him what real strength looked like, and it had nothing to do with social media fame or pulling pranks for attention. On the final day of his week at the Royal Hospital Chelsea, Marcus was surprised to see Sergeant James Wellington walking through the entrance. The sergeant was out of uniform, wearing civilian clothes, but he still carried himself with the same dignified bearing that had impressed Marcus so deeply during their first encounter. "I wanted to see how you've been getting along," James said simply as he approached Marcus, who was helping Thomas with his afternoon tea in the garden courtyard. Thomas looked up with interest. "James Wellington, I should have known you were behind this young man's education. Your father would be proud of how you handled this situation." Marcus stood nervously, unsure of what to expect. Over the past week, he had thought about Sergeant Wellington often, wondering what the man who had shown him such unexpected mercy would think of his progress. "Thomas has been telling me about your visits with him," James said to Marcus, "and I've been following your social media posts. They're quite different from your usual content." Marcus felt his face redden slightly. "Sergeant Wellington, I owe you an apology that goes far deeper than what I said in that security office. I understand now what I attacked when I threw that water at you. I disrespected something sacred, something that these men have devoted their lives to protecting and upholding." James nodded slowly. "And what exactly do you think you learned this week?" Marcus took a deep breath. knowing this was the most important answer he had ever given. I learned that service isn't about getting attention or recognition. It's about putting something bigger than yourself first, even when it's difficult or dangerous or thankless. I learned that the men and women who serve their countries carry a burden of responsibility that most of us never have to face. And I learned that what I thought was harmless fun was actually a mockery of values that good people have died defending. Thomas smiled and reached out to pat Marcus's hand. The boy learns well, James. He's got a good heart once you get past all that social media nonsense. James studied Marcus carefully, just as he had in the security office a week earlier. The question now is what you plan to do with this understanding. Your week here is finished, but the real test comes when you go back to your normal life. Will you remember these lessons when you're back in Denver? Or will you slip back into your old habits? Marcus had been dreading this question, but he also knew his answer was genuine. Sergeant Wellington, I can't go back to the way I was before. I've seen what real courage and service look like, and I can't pretend I haven't. I want to use my platform to continue sharing stories like these, to help other people understand what I learned here. And your pranking days? James asked with a slight smile. Over, Marcus said firmly. Completely over. I understand now that getting laughs at other people's expense isn't entertainment. It's just cruelty, dressed up as fun. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. The veterans here asked me to give you this. Marcus unwrapped it carefully and found a small pin bearing the insignia of the Royal Hospital Chelsea. It's not something we give lightly. It means you're considered a friend to this institution and the men who live here. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes as he held the pin. It was such a small thing, but it represented acceptance and respect from people whose opinion he had come to value more than any social media metrics. There's something else, James continued. I spoke with my commanding officer about your case. Your actions that day were serious enough to have resulted in criminal charges and possibly jail time. However, given your response over this past week and the recommendation of the veterans here, the matter will be considered closed with no permanent record. The relief Marcus felt was overwhelming, but it was mixed with a profound gratitude that went far beyond just avoiding legal consequences. Sergeant Wellington, how can I ever thank you for giving me this chance? You could have ruined my life, and instead you changed it for the better. James stood up and straightened his jacket. You can thank me by continuing to honor the lessons you've learned here. By using your influence to educate rather than to mock. By remembering that every person you encounter is fighting battles you know nothing about and deserves your respect. As James prepared to leave, Marcus called out to him one last time. Sergeant Wellington, will I see you again? James turned back with a genuine smile. I expect I will. Mr. Thompson, something tells me our paths will cross again, and when they do, I believe it will be under much better circumstances. 6 months later, Marcus returned to London, but this time his visit to Buckingham Palace was very different. He stood respectfully behind the barriers, watching the changing of the guard ceremony with reverence instead of looking for opportunities to disrupt it. When tourists around him joked about trying to make the guards react, Marcus quietly shared what he had learned about the dedication and sacrifice that the position represented. His social media presence had transformed completely. Instead of pranks and attention-seeking stunts, he now used his platform to share stories of service members, veterans, and everyday heroes who put others before themselves. His follower count had grown to over 200,000, but more importantly, his content was making a genuine positive impact on people's lives. Marcus never forgot the lesson that Sergeant James Wellington had taught him, that true strength comes not from seeking attention, but from serving something greater than yourself. And he never forgot that sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect is not punishment, but the patient work of education and understanding.